A people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. If Atlantis was the keystone, if it was the bridge between myth and memory, between Genesis and Göbekli Tepe, then the next step is clear. We have to follow the survivors. Because if even a handful of Atlanteans escaped the flood, they would not have vanished. They would have carried something with them: knowledge, memory, blood, and they would have passed it on. In this episode, we follow the survivors, not through legend, but through bones, tools, genes, and bloodlines. We'll examine the Clovis Mystery, the genetic fingerprints scattered across the Americas, and the strange way ancient identity may have survived inside the body itself. Because if Atlantis were real, it may have left a mark, and that mark may still be hidden within us. Welcome back to the third narrative. For decades, we were given a simple story. Humans entered North America by crossing a frozen land bridge from Siberia during the last ice age. They moved through an ice-free corridor, spread across the continent, hunted mammoths, built fires, and laid the groundwork for future civilizations. That's the version we're taught to accept. But the more you look into it, the more things don't add up. Let's start with the Clovis people, one of the oldest known cultures in North America. They are usually recognized by their tools, especially the famous Clovis point, which are finely sharp spear tips made from stone, bone, and ivory. These were not crude objects. They were carefully made, precise, skilled, and for a long time, Clovis culture was treated as one of the earliest major signs of human presence in the Americas. However, here's the problem. Some of the oldest Clovis sites are found in the eastern and southeastern parts of North America, not in the far northwest, which is where you would expect to find them if the migration story were simple. That is a pressure point in the story. How can some of the oldest Clovis sites appear thousands of miles away from the Bering Strait migration model would lead us to expect? So where did the Clovis people come from? What's interesting is that when some researchers compare Clovis tools with other Ice Age tool traditions, they find a possible resemblance, not in Asia, but in Europe. Some researchers have noted that Clovis points resemble tools from the Solutrean culture of Ice Age Europe, as we mentioned in episode 2. The Solutreans lived in Western Europe between roughly 21,000 and 17,000 years ago. They were highly skilled stoneworkers, producing blades and points with remarkable craftsmanship. At sites such as Cactus Hill in Virginia, archaeologists have found tools that some believe may bridge the gap between Solutrean and Clovis traditions. Now, the second narrative does not accept that as proof of a transatlantic migration. And to be fair, one tool comparison does not prove an ocean crossing. But the third narrative is not built on one isolated clue. It is built on clustering. So here is the question. If the Clovis people originated only from Asia, why do some of their tools resemble Ice Age European traditions? Why are the oldest Clovis sites in the east, not in the west of America? Are we looking at an independent invention, a lost migration, or some older pattern of contact that our simplified timeline does not know how to handle? If Atlantis was a maritime civilization, then this is exactly the kind of anomaly we would expect to find. Then we come to genetics. In 2012, a genetic study led by Nick Patterson of the Broad Institute challenged the overly simple version of the American origin story.
There is a genetic link between the Paleolithic population of Europe and modern Native Americans. The evidence suggests that the population that crossed into the Americas more than 15,000 years ago was likely related to the ancient population of Europe.
So what does that actually mean? It doesn't mean Atlantis was real. It doesn't mean Europeans sailed across the Atlantic and became Native Americans. But it does reveal something important. The ancestry behind the first peoples of the Americas is more complicated than the classroom version suggests. Some ancient populations associated with Native Americans also show deep genetic relationships with populations associated with Western Eurasia. The official explanation keeps this safely routed through Siberia and Beringia. And maybe that is part of the story. But the third narrative asks a different question. Why must every ancient connection be forced through the official gate? If deep genetic links point both east and west, why is the Atlantic possibility dismissed so quickly? This does not negate the Siberian ancestry of many Native American groups, but it does complicate the picture. It suggests that the ancient Americas may not have been populated by a single migration, a single route, or even a single people. It suggests a multi-layered origin story. And that matters because it challenges the simplistic land bridge only narrative that we're taught in school. It also lines up with something else we've already seen: flood stories across continents, oral traditions of ancestors arriving by sea. Again, no single clue proves the case, but together, the pattern begins to form. The question is not whether the official explanation can explain each clue in isolation. The question is whether it can explain why the clues keep clustering in the same area, near the Atlantic. Then there's Haplogroup X. When scientists analyzed mitochondria DNA, which is passed down only through the maternal line, they expected to find Asian markers in Native American populations. And they did. Haplogroups A, B, C, and D are all common in Siberia and are found among native groups as expected. But there was also another marker, Haplogroup X. Around 3% of Native Americans carry Haplogroup X, and among some indigenous groups near the Great Lakes, such as the Ojibwe, it has been found at much higher levels. This is where the mystery begins. Haplogroup X is not common in East Asia in the same way as the other Native American founder lineages. Related branches are found across parts of Western Eurasia and the Near East. Now, mainstream geneticists argue that the Native American branch, which is X2A, does not prove a Solutrean or Atlantean crossing, and that is fair. But the third narrative is not claiming that one genetic marker proves everything. We are asking why this marker, these tools, these flood stories, and these visitor myths keep pointing to the same broader possibility. The official answer is that Haplogroup X entered the Americas through an ancient population connected to Beringia. But from the third narrative lens, that explanation feels like the safest possible route. It keeps every mystery inside the accepted map. It keeps the Atlantic sealed away. It keeps the Americas isolated until the official timeline allows contact. But what if the story was never that simple? What if Haplogroup X is not proof by itself, but another pressure point, another breadcrumb, another reminder that the genetic history of the Americas may be older, stranger, and more layered than the second narrative wants to admit? Now we move from genetics into something more symbolic: blood. Because throughout ancient history, blood is never just biology. Blood is lineage. It is inheritance, authority, divine right. The Bible speaks of the sons of God coming down to the daughters of men before the flood. Plato describes Poseidon fathering children with a mortal woman, producing the royal bloodline of Atlantis. Across myth, the same pattern repeats. A higher being descends. A human lineage is changed, and the children of that union become rulers, kings, heroes, or giants. So when ancient stories speak of divine bloodlines, we have to ask, were they only speaking metaphorically, or were they remembering something that had once been understood more literally? This is where Rh-negative blood enters the conversation. In most humans, about 85%, there exists a protein in the blood known as the rhesus factor, or Rh factor. These individuals are called Rh positive, but the remaining percentage lack this protein. They are Rh negative. Why does this matter? Because if an Rh negative mother carries an Rh positive child, her immune system can recognize the baby's blood as foreign. If fetal blood enters the mother's bloodstream, her immune system can form antibodies against those Rh positive cells. And in later pregnancies, those antibodies can cross the placenta and attack the baby's red blood cells. Not metaphorically, literally. Taken far enough, without intervention, that process can become life-threatening. Now, modern medicine can treat it, but the question remains, why would a mother's body ever identify her own child's blood as foreign? Why would reproduction itself carry this kind of internal conflict? Are we looking at nothing more than a medical quirk? Or are we seeing a biological echo of something ancient cultures remembered as bloodline difference? Now, Rh-negative blood alone does not prove Atlantis. It does not prove anything supernatural, but symbolically, it is striking because ancient cultures were obsessed with this kind of distinction. Pure blood, royal blood, divine blood, blue blood. The phrase blue blood comes from the Spanish sangre azul, which is associated with noble lineages and visible veins beneath pale skin. Was that phrase secretly about Rh-negative blood? We cannot prove that, but the association is worth noticing. Not because it gives us a scientific conclusion, but because it shows how deeply blood and power have always been connected. And yet, the mystery deepens when you look even further back. Some researchers speculate that the Cro-Magnons may have carried this rare blood factor. Robert Sepper pushes this argument much further than mainstream science would allow. In Species with Amnesia, he writes,
If mankind evolved from the same African ancestor, then everyone's blood would be compatible, but it is not. Rhesus-negative blood type appears suddenly 35,000 years ago in Cro-Magnon. Where did the Rh-negatives come from? Humanity isn't one race, but a hybrid species.
I'm not asking you to accept this as a settled science, but I am asking you to notice the question he is willing to ask. Why do bloodline traditions, genetic anomalies, royal myths, and ancient origin stories keep circling the same theme? A different blood, a changed lineage, a people set apart. The Cro-Magnons did not evolve slowly from Neanderthals. They arrived in the record as early modern humans, bringing art, music, stone tools, and symbolic culture unlike anything seen before. These people were different, and they settled in areas facing the Atlantic, the very direction where Plato places Atlantis. And here's where the trail gets even more intriguing. Remember those Cro-Magnon cave paintings in Lascaux? Similar prehistoric cave art also appears in Altamira, which lies in the broader Franco-Cantabrian cave art region near the Basque world. And today, the Basque population is famous for having one of the highest percentages of Rh blood in the world, often estimated at around 35%. That does not mean the Basques are Atlanteans, but in the symbolic geography of the series, they matter, because the trail points toward the Atlantic. And the Basques are not alone. When researchers and alternative historians map Rh-negative concentrations, another pattern begins to appear. in Berber populations of North Africa, the highlands of Scotland and the Isle of Mull, the Karaite Jews of Iraq, a Dutch fishing town, Bunschoten, Spankenberg, and even across the Atlantic in the Mayans, Incas, and Araucanians of Chile. Rh-negative blood appears in ways that have drawn attention from researchers asking whether old contacts remain hidden in the genetic record. Again, by itself this proves nothing, but this series is not built on isolated proof. This series is built on clustering, because while these groups are scattered across continents, they're not random. Many cluster around Atlantic-facing regions, especially in Western Europe and Northern Africa. They also appear in regions where ancient myths of divine origin, floods, visitors, and forgotten ancestors are strongest. While the blood evidence alone is not enough, when paired with the tools, myths, flood memories, ancient anomalies, and maritime legends, it becomes part of a larger pattern, a breadcrumb, not a conclusion. And then there are the outliers that remind us not to think too simply. In the Tarim Basin of Western China, archaeologists discovered mummies thousands of years old, preserved with striking features, woven textiles, boat-shaped coffins, and symbols that seem to point beyond a purely local story. For years, many assumed that these people might have been migrants from the West, but modern DNA complicated that idea. The earliest Tarim mummies appear to have been more locally rooted than researchers expected, tied to deep inner Asian ancestry rather than a simple Western migration. And yet culturally, they were not isolated. Their textiles, foodways, burial customs, and symbols connect them to a much wider world. That is why they matter. The Tarim mummies show that ancient knowledge did not always travel the way modern textbooks expect. Sometimes, blood stays local, while symbols travel across continents. Sometimes a people can be genetically rooted in one place, while carrying fragments of a much older, wider symbolic system. And if Atlantis left survivors behind, that is exactly the kind of evidence we should expect to find. Not always a clean bloodline, not always a direct migration, but local peoples carrying foreign symbols, sacred patterns, advanced practices, and memories from a world that came before. Later in the series, we will return to the Tarim mummies for a different reason, because one of the symbols found with them offers us another clue in our investigation. So what have we actually found? Clovis tools that raise questions about the simplicity of the migration story. Solutrean comparisons that suggest older technological echoes across the Atlantic world. Haplogroup X, a genetic marker that keeps the debate open. Rh-negative blood, not as proof of Atlantis, but as a symbolically powerful anomaly tied to lineage, inheritance, and identity. The Basque world, the Atlantic fringe, North Africa, ancient cave cultures, and indigenous traditions that preserve memories of floods, visitors, and lost origins. And the Tarim mummies, strange outliers reminding us that ancient populations and symbols move through the world in ways that modern maps struggle to explain. Behind all of it, the same recurring theme. Humanity may not be as rootless as the second narrative implies. The past may not be a straight line from primitive survival to modern progress. It may be a broken tree, branches cut, roots buried, names forgotten, but traces remain in stone, in myth, in blood, and maybe even in us. Mainstream history often treats these echoes as coincidences, but the oldest oral traditions preserve them differently. And that is where we turn next. In the next episode, we leave the tools and bloodlines behind and follow the living memory. Myths and legends carried across generations. Because among indigenous peoples of the Americas are stories not only of kings, but of teachers, strangers who came from across the sea, figures associated with knowledge, healing, law, agriculture, and the stars. And then they vanish. Were they survivors of Atlantis? That is the mystery we step into next. I'll see you in the next episode.